When she first stepped into that bank, it wasn't just about asking for a loan, it was about the culmination of months, even years, of hard work, planning, and preparing for a future she could already see so clearly in her mind. She had her business plan neatly bound, every number accounted for, projections mapped out with meticulous care. She wore her best suit, hoping to project confidence and credibility, knowing how critical first impressions can be. From the outside, she seemed like the model loan candidate, a stable income, a solid idea, community ties, and the drive to follow through. But as she sat across from the banker, she couldn't help but notice the slight tightening of his expression, the disinterest in his eyes as she began to explain her vision. He glanced at her paperwork with minimal effort, flipping through pages quickly, not pausing to really examine the details. There was no meaningful engagement with the proposal, no probing questions about growth strategy or market research, nothing that indicated genuine consideration. It was as if the decision had been made before she even sat down. The conversation was short, almost perfunctory. He asked about her credit score, her collateral, her background. She answered clearly, confidently, presenting supporting documents. But his tone carried a hint of dismissal that went beyond professional detachment, it felt personal. When he said, "I'm sorry, but we're going to have to pass," there was no offer of guidance, no suggestion of alternative funding paths, no constructive feedback. Just a polite but cold rejection. And though he never said the words outright, she knew what had happened. She knew the weight of unspoken prejudice, the way it hangs in the air without needing to be named. She had felt it before, in job interviews, in business networking events, in the subtle ways people shift their assumptions about you the moment you walk into a room. The loan denial wasn't just a matter of risk assessment. It was the kind of decision shaped by a bias that had nothing to do with numbers. That moment was more than just a personal setback, it was a reflection of a larger, deeply rooted problem. Studies and statistics have long shown that Black entrepreneurs face disproportionately high rejection rates when seeking funding, even when their financial profiles match or exceed those of white applicants. Discrimination often hides behind objective business criteria, but the pattern is too consistent to ignore. She knew she was now another data point in that pattern, another story in a long line of stories where opportunity was withheld not because of merit, but because of race. It's one thing to understand this reality in theory, it's another to be sitting in that chair, feeling your dream quietly shut out before it even has a chance to breathe. Her mind raced in the aftermath. She thought about the countless hours she had spent preparing her application, the sacrifices she had made to save money, the late nights drafting and redrafting her business plan. She thought about the people in her community who would benefit from her vision, the potential jobs she could create, the services she could provide. And she thought about how, in one swift moment, someone who barely knew her had decided she wasn't worth the investment. The unfairness was sharp and heavy. She couldn't shake the image of his expression, calm, polite, but unmoved, while holding in his hands the power to say yes and choosing instead to say no. The sting of that denial lingered, not just because it delayed her plans, but because it served as a reminder of how the game is often rigged from the start. For many people, a rejection like that would be the end of the story. The bank's word is final, the dream fades, and life moves on in another direction. But for her, this was a pivotal moment of clarity. She could see with undeniable certainty that the problem wasn't her preparation, her numbers, or her business potential. The problem was a system that had already decided who gets access and who doesn't, often before the application is even opened. It was a problem that had existed for generations, locking countless talented and capable individuals out of opportunities they more than deserved. It was the same problem that had kept Black business ownership rates disproportionately low, not because of a lack of ambition or skill, but because of persistent, systemic exclusion from financial resources. The rejection could have been the point where everything stopped. She could have walked out of that bank, accepted the decision as final, and quietly folded her plans away in a drawer. But something inside her refused to let that moment define her future. The sting of being underestimated, the insult of being dismissed, and the quiet fury of knowing why it happened all blended into a fire she hadn't felt before. That fire wasn't fueled only by ambition, it was fueled by the injustice of it all, by the knowledge that the very thing meant to support small business owners had instead acted as a gatekeeper, shutting her out because of something she could not and would not change. She left the bank with empty hands but a full determination that she would find another way, no matter how long it took or how hard it would be. Her first step was to transform her disappointment into strategy. She took the same business plan she had presented and went over it again, not because it was flawed, but because she wanted to make it so airtight that no one could ever say she wasn't ready. She reran her financial projections, refined her marketing approach, and identified every possible income stream the business could generate. Then she turned her focus to the tools and resources she could access without relying on traditional banks. She began researching alternative funding options, community lending circles, microfinance institutions, crowdfunding platforms, and small grants for minority-owned businesses. What she found was that there were pockets of opportunity out there, but they weren't advertised on billboards or mentioned in glossy brochures at the bank. They were often hidden, passed along through word of mouth or small networks that shared information among those who had been excluded from the mainstream financial system. She reached out to other entrepreneurs, especially those who had faced similar obstacles. Many of them understood immediately what she was going through, because they had lived it themselves. They told her stories of being told no by banks over and over, of being asked to produce excessive collateral, of being offered smaller amounts at higher interest rates than their white counterparts. These conversations didn't discourage her, they sharpened her resolve. She began to see herself not as a lone fighter against an isolated injustice, but as part of a much larger movement of people pushing back against an entrenched system. That sense of solidarity gave her new energy to keep going. With each meeting, each piece of advice, and each new contact, her strategy evolved. She learned how to pitch her business in a way that emphasized not just profitability, but the social and community impact it would have. She learned how to navigate funding applications so that her proposals would stand out. She found mentors who had built successful companies from scratch without ever walking through the doors of a big-name bank. These mentors didn't just tell her it could be done, they showed her the steps, the pitfalls, and the workarounds that had made it possible for them. She absorbed every lesson, writing down ideas late at night, waking up early to send emails, and setting small daily goals that kept her moving forward even when progress felt slow. The banker's rejection had given her something she hadn't expected, clarity about the kind of entrepreneur she wanted to be. She didn't want to build her business to simply prove a point, although that was part of it. She wanted to build it so well, so strong, and so independently that no one could ever again have the power to tell her she couldn't do it. Every setback she encountered after that, whether it was a supplier backing out, a lease falling through, or an unexpected expense, was met with the same stubborn refusal to quit. She had already faced one of the most demoralizing no's a business owner could receive, and she had survived it. Everything else was just another obstacle to work around. She began to notice a shift in how she approached challenges. Where before she might have seen a problem as a wall, she now saw it as a puzzle. If one path was blocked, she looked for another. If one resource was denied, she found an alternative. This mindset became her quiet weapon. It meant that every moment of frustration was also a moment of adaptation. And slowly, without the banker's help, she was piecing together the resources she needed. Not just money, but knowledge, connections, and a reputation in her community as someone who was relentless in pursuing her vision. The rejection had lit a spark, but it was her own willpower and strategic thinking that turned that spark into something much stronger. She started with what she had, knowing that waiting for perfect conditions would only delay her progress indefinitely. The dream she carried in her mind was too vivid to be put on hold, so she began building piece by piece. At first, it was small steps, selling services directly to friends, family, and neighbors, offering promotions to get her first customers, and using her own savings to purchase the most essential tools and supplies. Every dollar that came in was stretched to cover both immediate needs and small reinvestments into the business. There were no grand openings or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. There was simply the work, steady, consistent, and deliberate. Without the cushion of a bank loan, she became resourceful in ways she hadn't anticipated. She learned how to negotiate with suppliers to get better terms, how to barter services in exchange for equipment, and how to find second-hand materials that could serve the same purpose as brand new ones. She sought out free or low-cost workshops on marketing, bookkeeping, and digital tools, sometimes traveling across town to attend community events where experts shared advice. These gatherings not only gave her practical skills, but also connected her with others who were building businesses under similar constraints. In those connections, she found a quiet reassurance, proof that success was possible even without the traditional financial pathways. Her living space began to transform into a hybrid between a home and a small-scale operation. Boxes, tools, and paperwork took up corners of her apartment. Late nights were spent refining products, preparing orders, or brainstorming new services to meet customer demand. She used her phone and a basic laptop as her command center, managing everything from marketing campaigns to client communication. Social media became her storefront, and she poured time into creating content that told her story and showcased her work. Every post, every customer review, every small mention from a satisfied client was fuel for growth. As the months passed, she began to notice patterns in her market, what customers responded to, what products or services sold fastest, and which approaches yielded the most profit. She adjusted her strategies accordingly, always testing and refining. Small wins began to stack on top of each other. A local community leader mentioned her business in an interview. A satisfied client referred 3 more people. A neighborhood newsletter featured her story, bringing in a surge of inquiries. These weren't massive breakthroughs, but they were steady progress, each one pushing her a step closer to stability. She reinvested nearly everything back into the business, resisting the temptation to spend on non-essentials. When she upgraded her tools, it was because she had outgrown the old ones. When she expanded her product line, it was because demand clearly called for it. Every move was calculated, and every dollar was treated with the respect of someone who knew how hard it had been to earn without institutional support. This discipline became one of her greatest strengths, allowing her to grow sustainably without sinking into debt. Alongside the tangible growth, something less visible was happening. She was building a reputation, not just for her products or services, but for her reliability, her professionalism, and her persistence. Customers began to associate her brand with trust, knowing that if they placed an order or booked a service, it would be delivered with care and quality. This trust became a currency of its own, opening doors to opportunities that couldn't be bought with money. Collaborations with other small businesses emerged naturally, and she began to participate in community events, setting up booths where she could meet potential clients face to face. Her vision for the business expanded as her foundation strengthened. What started as a way to survive and prove herself was evolving into something larger, a company that could eventually employ others, create opportunities, and have a lasting impact on the community. She started to imagine storefronts, larger production spaces, and broader outreach. These ideas didn't feel like distant fantasies anymore. They felt like plans that simply required time and continued effort. The absence of a bank loan had initially seemed like a disadvantage, but now she saw it differently. It had forced her to build with patience, intention, and resilience, laying a foundation that could withstand challenges. Each sale, each satisfied customer, and each small milestone reinforced her belief that she was moving in the right direction, even if the path was slower than she once envisioned. From the very beginning, she understood that the challenges in front of her were bigger than one person's determination. The path she was walking was not just about learning how to run a business, it was about navigating a landscape shaped by decades of systemic inequality. Every obstacle she faced was part of a pattern that had been built into the very structure of opportunity in her industry. It wasn't just the denial from the bank that revealed this reality, it was the countless subtle and not so subtle ways that access to resources, connections, and markets were unevenly distributed. She knew she had to learn how to survive within that reality while also finding ways to push against it. There were moments when the barriers felt exhausting. Applying for certain programs meant proving herself twice over, meeting requirements that seemed designed to filter out those who didn't already have advantages. Some networking events were welcoming on the surface but cold underneath, with conversations that ended quickly once people learned she didn't have a large investor backing her. Even the vendors she approached sometimes quoted her higher prices or required stricter payment terms than she later learned they offered to others. These were not isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a system where unspoken biases could quietly shape outcomes. But she refused to let those realities push her into despair. Instead, she treated each barrier as something to be studied, understood, and navigated. If a vendor gave her a higher price, she looked for competitors, negotiated more aggressively, or joined group purchasing arrangements with other small business owners to leverage collective buying power. If an event felt exclusionary, she sought out alternative spaces, community-based gatherings, grassroots entrepreneurship meetups, and minority-led business networks, where she could build genuine connections without having to prove her worth at the door. She began to understand that while the mainstream business world might be full of closed gates, there were other paths running alongside it, created and maintained by people who had faced the same locked doors. Learning to operate in this environment required more than just hard work. It demanded constant vigilance, an ability to read situations quickly, and a willingness to adapt strategy on the fly. She became skilled at identifying opportunities that others overlooked, often because they were too focused on conventional paths. She found value in partnerships with organizations that weren't well known but were deeply committed to supporting underrepresented entrepreneurs. She applied for microgrants that most people ignored because of the small dollar amounts, knowing that even a modest boost could fund the next stage of growth. She paid attention to policy changes, advocacy efforts, and community initiatives, looking for openings that could help her advance despite the limitations around her. At the same time, she carried a growing awareness of how these systemic barriers weren't just affecting her, they were affecting an entire generation of entrepreneurs who looked like her, who had similar dreams but faced the same walls. This awareness became part of her motivation. Each time she broke through a barrier, she didn't just see it as a personal win, she saw it as proof that the system could be worked around, that others could follow the same cracks in the wall and widen them. She began to share her experiences more openly with other business owners, exchanging strategies for overcoming common obstacles. These conversations were as valuable as any formal training, because they came from people living the reality rather than from someone speaking about it in theory. She also learned how to anticipate bias before it happened. In certain situations, she adjusted her presentations to disarm skepticism early, leading with evidence of results and testimonials before even getting to her background or origin story. In others, she leaned into her authenticity, refusing to hide her identity or her purpose even when she knew it might close some doors. This balance, knowing when to adapt and when to stand firm, became one of the hardest skills to master, but also one of the most important. The barriers were still there, but they no longer had the power to stop her completely. Each time she found a way over, around, or through them, she built more confidence in her ability to keep moving forward. She knew the system wouldn't change overnight, but she also knew that her persistence, combined with the persistence of others like her, was part of the slow, steady pressure that eventually forces change. The same forces that had once tried to keep her out were now fueling her determination to build something so solid that no one could take it away. Reaching a position of leadership and ownership did not happen in a single leap, it was the result of countless small steps, deliberate choices, and an unwavering commitment to the vision she had been building from the very start. As her business grew, so did her role in shaping its future. What had once been a solo effort, managing every task from marketing to bookkeeping, slowly evolved into something much larger, requiring her to make decisions that would affect not just herself, but the people she began to bring into her team. The shift from working in the business to leading the business was gradual but powerful. She had to learn how to delegate, how to inspire, and how to trust others with pieces of the dream she had guarded so closely. The first hires were part-time and often came from her own community, people who believed in what she was building and wanted to contribute. She trained them personally, not just in the technical skills needed for the job, but in the values she wanted the company to stand for: reliability, respect, and excellence. As the team grew, she began to see herself differently. She was no longer simply surviving or proving a point to those who doubted her. She was shaping a culture, creating opportunities, and setting standards that reflected her own journey. Leadership, she realized, wasn't just about giving directions, it was about setting an example every single day. Ownership brought with it a different kind of responsibility. Every decision, whether it was expanding into a new market, investing in equipment, or taking on a new client, carried the weight of knowing it could affect the livelihoods of her employees and the stability of the business. She became more deliberate in her planning, often spending long evenings reviewing numbers, considering risks, and consulting trusted advisors before moving forward. She also recognized that being the owner meant more than managing the internal workings of the company. It meant representing it to the outside world. She was the face of the brand, the voice in negotiations, and the person who had to answer when challenges arose. With this role came a growing sense of independence. The same institutions that had once denied her now saw her as a peer, even if their recognition came too late to matter. She no longer needed their approval or their funding to validate her success. The business was thriving on its own terms, and she had built it without compromising her identity or her values. That autonomy was one of her greatest rewards. It meant she could choose who to work with, what opportunities to pursue, and how to reinvest in both the company and the community that had supported her. Her position also gave her a platform to address the very issues she had faced in the beginning. She began mentoring other aspiring entrepreneurs, particularly women and people of color, offering guidance on how to navigate the same barriers she had encountered. She shared not just her successes, but also her mistakes, believing that transparency could save others from learning the hard way. In doing so, she expanded her influence beyond her own business, contributing to a wider network of leadership that was slowly reshaping the business landscape. Leadership also meant learning to adapt constantly. The market shifted, competitors emerged, and unexpected challenges arose, from economic downturns to supply chain disruptions. Each time, she returned to the mindset that had carried her through the early days: resilience, resourcefulness, and the belief that no challenge was permanent. Her team came to trust that no matter how uncertain things became, she would guide them through with both strategy and steadiness. Over time, the business began to feel like more than just a source of income or a personal victory. It became a legacy in progress. She could see the impact it was having: jobs created, local suppliers supported, customers served with care, and young people inspired to imagine possibilities for themselves. This was the deeper reward of ownership, knowing that the work mattered on a scale larger than her own success. Every decision, every hire, and every new opportunity added another layer to that legacy, one that had been built without the help of those who once doubted her and without compromising the principles that had guided her from the start. What began as a deeply personal fight to overcome a single act of discrimination evolved into a mission to transform injustice into a source of empowerment, not only for herself but for others who had been silenced or sidelined. The memory of being turned away at the bank was still vivid, but it no longer stung in the same way. Instead, it served as a constant reminder of why she worked as hard as she did and why she refused to let opportunities slip past without reaching back to pull others forward. She had turned a moment of exclusion into a blueprint for creating access, and that shift became one of the most powerful aspects of her story. Her success gave her credibility, but it was her willingness to share the truth behind that success that made her influence stronger. She didn't paint her journey as flawless or effortless. She spoke openly about the rejections, the barriers, and the moments she nearly walked away. By being honest about the realities of building a business as a Black woman in a system not designed to support her, she allowed others to see themselves in her story. That connection became a source of courage for people who were still in the early stages of chasing their goals. They saw that setbacks did not have to mean the end, and that sometimes the very experiences meant to hold them back could become the reason they pushed forward harder than ever. She began to use her platform deliberately, advocating for changes in how funding opportunities were distributed and how bias was addressed in business communities. Speaking at events, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and partnering with organizations dedicated to equity, she made sure her influence reached beyond her own company. She knew that her success alone would not dismantle the barriers that kept others out, but she believed in the ripple effect. Every person she helped could go on to help someone else, slowly widening the path for those who came next. Her voice carried weight because it came from lived experience, and she used it to challenge the notion that success was reserved for those who already had access. Inside her own company, empowerment became a core value. She created policies that prioritized fair pay, professional development, and opportunities for growth, ensuring that the people who worked with her felt valued and supported. She understood what it was like to be underestimated, and she was determined to make sure no one in her sphere experienced that same disregard. Employees were encouraged to bring ideas, take ownership of projects, and see themselves as integral to the business's success. This culture of empowerment not only strengthened her team but also reinforced her own belief that leadership was about lifting others alongside you, not standing above them. Her impact began to show in ways that were sometimes quiet but deeply significant. A former employee started their own successful venture and credited her mentorship as the spark that made it possible. A young entrepreneur she had advised went on to win a grant that had once felt out of reach. Customers, inspired by her story, became loyal supporters and recommended her business to others. Each of these moments was a reminder that the real measure of success wasn't just financial, it was in how many people felt encouraged to pursue their own visions because they had seen her do it against the odds. Even in moments when the work was exhausting, she found strength in remembering where it all started. The same rejection that could have closed the door on her dreams had instead become the push she needed to create something that not only sustained her but also built openings for others. The banker's no had been transformed into a chain of yes for people who might never meet him but whose opportunities now existed, in part, because of that single decision. The injustice had not been erased, but it had been redefined, reshaped into fuel for something far greater than what anyone in that bank office could have imagined.